Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis pacem.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Good morning. Good morning. We're going to wrap up the 8th chapter in the textbook, The History of the Church, on collapse, corruption, and reform in Europe and the Catholic Church. Last week we spoke on the first 3 parts of that chapter: the Carolingian world collapse, Clunian monastic reform, and the New Temporal Order. And this week we're going to speak about the lay investiture controversies, and we're going to speak about the formation, very briefly, of the Cistercians and the Carthusians. Let's look at the controversies called the lay investitures. Simply put, the lay investitures can be stated in a very simple statement. Who should appoint bishops, secular or religious leaders? Simply stated, far more complex. As we looked at history and the evolution of the church and the temporal order, we saw that there was quite an incredible combination of authority and roles within that growth, both in the temporal order and in the spread of the church. Bishops had authority over large churches. Abbots had authority over large monasteries, and of a sort they ruled those monasteries as a temporal ruler. Kings and other rulers needed to have a good relationship with bishops. Bishops needed to have a good relationship with the kings. And so there was always this intermingling of authority and power in the course of the development of culture. And so up to and including even when Charlemagne's empire, the Carolingian Empire, collapses in the late 8th century, there was this incredible melding of power and authority. And so, although it's clear to us today that the church has the authority to appoint bishops, it wasn't then. And so, truly stated, it is simple. Who has that authority? But it took some effort and a number of centuries to work it out. Let's look then at a couple of specific and the higher point resolutions that had to occur as this lay investiture controversy works itself out. And so we find it at its height in the late 11th century as the investiture issue had reached universal proportions. Everywhere, every country in which the church was in, there was this commingling of authority between the bishops, among the bishop and its local ruler. But because of Cluny, because of the restoration of that monastic rule in the early 11th century, the papacy became involved in that move to reform the church and bring her back to the idea of spiritual growth. Enter Pope St. Gregory VII, who was at the heart of this, the beginning of the resolution of this investiture issue. So Pope St. Gregory was born Hildebrand around 1020, and he died in 1085. He entered the church as a young man and became a cardinal at a very early age. And he was an important member of the papal household, as it were, for his predecessor, Pope Alexander II, who ruled as Pope from 1061 to 1073. And because he was so well known in the papal household, at Pope Alexander's funeral, there was a spontaneous cry for Hildebrand to be elected to the role of Pope, and he did so. He became Pope Gregory VII, and he was 53 years of age. He reigned for 12 years, from 1073 to 1085, and he was known to have a penetrating mind, an iron will, and much energy and relentless perseverance. And so, Pope St. Gregory VII issues something that caused quite a stir in the culture at the time. He issued the document Dictatus Papae, the dictate of the Pope. And it was a decree of 27 significant points that should and are to be enforced by the Church. Now, they aren't new, and they weren't new at the time. They were existing, but they hadn't been well enforced. So let's look at a few of those points that were issued as part of that document at the time. Again, they were quite controversial. Number one is that it's the Pope who convenes and ratifies a council, and the Pope alone. It's the Pope who defines the tenets of the faith. It's the Pope who manages the office of bishop. The Pope could depose a temporal ruler if that temporal ruler was ruling not in accord with church teaching. The Pope could declare that a subject may appeal a ruler's decision against them, and that the Pope could overturn that sovereign's authority. The Pope could impose stiff penalties for simony, and that stiff penalty included up to the point where the person appointed as bishop or abbot would be removed. The Pope instituted or enforced that a priest found guilty of fornication lost the authority to celebrate the sacraments. Pope St. Gregory VII also began the process of developing canon law to establish the rules of behavior both for the clergy and for the faithful within the church. And so these are some of the points within the Dictatus Papae that, when promulgated, caused quite a stir in the temporal order. As you can imagine, if the Pope can overrule a sovereign's authority, that certainly sent some chilling thoughts through the rulers' heads. So enter the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Specifically in defiance of the Dictatus Papae, Henry IV appoints the Bishop of Milan. The Pope asks him not to do so. Private discussions, Henry does so anyway. So Pope St. Gregory immediately deposes Henry as emperor and releases his subjects from their rule. Now, Henry IV was not a popular ruler, and so many of his subjects were rather grateful for this. He also excommunicated Henry from the church, thereby stripping him of access to the support of the bishops in his empire, the bishops he appointed. The ecclesial penalty of engaging Henry IV once he's excommunicated for a bishop is for the bishop himself to be rejected by the church and possibly be excommunicated. And so the Pope was a master tactician in this case. And so Henry's only course of action, again, papal excommunication requires papal forgiveness. And so his only course was to seek forgiveness of the Pope. And he did so at a famous event at Canossa, Italy, at the villa of the Countess Matilda of Tuscany, who happened to be a relative of Henry IV, and this happens in January 1077. Henry approaches the estate dressed in sackcloth and barefoot, and spent 3 days waiting barefoot in the snow for the Pope to see him. But it was Hugh of Cluny, and if you remember, we spoke about Hugh of Cluny having some important participation in the resolution of the lay controversies, and this is one of the events that he participated in. He challenged the Holy Father that, as a matter of ecclesial responsibility, that he was required to see a penitent who sought forgiveness. And so Pope St. Gregory sees Henry, hears his confession, absolves him, and restores him to his throne. Within a year, however, Henry IV, a rather persistent man, appoints Clement III as the antipope. So Pope St. Gregory then turns to the Normans for support and ends up having to do battle with the Holy Roman Emperor. And in the end, Pope St. Gregory retreats to southern Italy, dies in exile. However, Henry IV's rule from this point on is rife with internal strife. He's fighting with his nobles and is unable to accomplish much of anything else in his reign, which lasted until 1105. And so we see two very powerful, strong-willed individuals battling it out, and each using wisely or unwisely the power and authority they had in their roles. The next thing we want to look at in terms of this lay investiture thing as a means of resolving this issue of who has authority is the Concordat of Worms. Happened in 1122. The issues that we talked about with St. Gregory and St. Gregory VII and the Emperor Henry's battles didn't end at that. They continued. And we will look at England and France in a few minutes, and we'll see that those countries had their own issues that we're going to want to talk about. But again, back to the Concordat. The Concordat happens in September of 1122 in the city of Worms. It's, again, just south of Frankfurt in Germany. It was a meeting between Pope Callistus II and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. And the terms of the Concordat are this: spiritual investiture rests with the church alone. The ring and the crozier were the purview of the church. And the allegiance of the bishops and the abbots was to the papacy alone. The elections of the bishops were to be free of temporal influence. The practice of simony was again condemned, and that's the not necessarily qualified appointment of a relative into a role of high responsibility. However, an emperor could veto the election of a bishop of a diocese where that bishop was accorded great temporal authority. And so there was some understanding at the time that it wasn't perfect, because again, bishops and abbots did have temporal rule and temporal authority, but the emperor could have a say in that aspect of the appointment. So, the Concordat of Worms specifically establishes who appoints bishops and abbots, the leaders of the local churches. Let's look then, as I mentioned, at a little bit of what occurred in England. So the investiture, a high point of a conflict in England, and just a quick sidebar, these investiture issues that we're looking at are some major high points. They are by far not the only ones that were occurring, but simply the ones that are being called forth as examples of how high-leveled these interferences reigned during this time in history. And so let's look at Henry II. Henry II lived from 1133 to 1189, and he was king from 1154 to 1189. He was a very powerful monarch, and he was facing a very powerful church in the Church of England. And he sought to consolidate that power, and so he chose his advisor and friend, St. Thomas of Becket, as Archbishop of Canterbury, as hopefully a means of unifying that force, that authority. But St. Thomas, being the honorable man he was, told Henry II not to do so. But with the support of Cardinal Henry of Posa, Henry II did indeed appoint St. Thomas. St. Thomas accepts the position with great fervor and embraces the role of Archbishop of Canterbury, the rule of the church. In 1164, Henry II issues the Constitutions of Clarendon, in which he sought to gain control of the revenues of the episcopal sees and monasteries. He wanted to be able to appoint bishops and abbots. He ordered that the clerics if they were to go on trial for any reason, were to be tried in a civil court. He ordered that any appeal to Rome, in accord with papal authority, would require trial in civil court and approval of the king before it could go to Rome, and that the king's court was the last resort for ecclesial appeals. Well, one might imagine St. Thomas stood almost alone in absolute opposition to the constitutions, in conjunction with Pope Alexander III at the time. Because of the torment, St. Thomas flees to France to hide in a Cistercian monastery. But Henry II threatens the entire order of Cistercians that if they don't turn Henry II over, that they would be tormented. Pope Alexander III threatens Henry with excommunication, forcing Henry to reconcile with St. Thomas, and St. Thomas returns to England to resume his fight and his duties, his fight in England and his duties as Archbishop of Canterbury. Well, Henry's annoyance with St. Thomas reaches a high point in 1170, and through some comments in court, St. Thomas was murdered at the hands of one of Henry's nobles, and St. Thomas is murdered again in 1170 in his cathedral church while celebrating the liturgy. An interesting thing is St. Thomas Becket was canonized 2 years later. However, this proved the undoing of Henry II, and for the last 19 years of his reign, he was haunted. He was betrayed by his wife and children. He, at one point, had himself scourged at the tomb of his friend because of the betrayal and the monstrosity that he had become. And one might imagine he ultimately gave up his efforts to control the church and died an unpleasant, defeated death. So, let's look then a little bit more deeply at some of the lay investiture issues that were occurring in the empire. And again, the empire is that area of Germany to Italy, including that central part of Europe. Less so France and Spain. France was its own kingdom at the time. And so the church in the empire, between 1152 and 1254, some of the keenest legal minds graced the church of Central Europe, and some very great events were unfolding. Let's look first at Frederick I Barbarossa. Frederick lived 1122 to 1190, and he reigned as Holy Roman Emperor from 1155 to 1190. He was the ablest and most powerful of the Holy Roman Emperors. He believed, however, that his God-given role was to revive the Roman Empire in its entirety. He believed that he had the authority, and by that call, to appoint the Bishop of Rome. And he continued in dismissal of the Concordat of Worms to appoint bishops and abbots regardless. Well, Pope Adrian IV threatened him with excommunication, and Frederick I totally ignored it, and to the point that he imprisoned the papal legate that was sent to stop his activities. Frederick I engaged in 5 separate military forays into England to gain control of Rome and failed at each. And on his 4th expedition, it is said that he lost 25,000 troops to a plague. After the 5th defeat, he was forced to reconcile with the church, and again, that's Pope Alexander III. Frederick I, through all of the machinations with Pope Alexander III, was eventually killed crossing the Salif River in northern Turkey while on his way to a church-mandated Third Crusade. Let's look then at Innocent III and Frederick II, for they are well tied together. First, let's look at Pope Innocent III. He lived 1160 to 1216, and he reigned 1198 to 1216 as Pope. Lothar Segni-Conti was elected pope at age 37. And there's some dispute about Pope Innocent III. The dispute is, was he a pious man or a ruthless tyrant? Rather than choosing the title of Vicar of St. Peter, as was church history, he coined the title Vicar of Christ. And he used this image. He said that the Pope is the sun, and the temporal rulers are the moon. Temporal authority passes through the church, that is the Pope, to the king. So he didn't declare supreme right in temporal matters, but he did declare them in spiritual matters. So insofar as a temporal ruler exercised a certain degree of spiritual authority in spiritual matters, the Pope had authority over him. Now, to his credit, Innocent III's primary interest was to maintain the balance of power in Europe, but with him as arbiter. He interfered in the affairs of every feudal kingdom in whose king fell from the state of grace. A couple of examples, Philip II of France, when he divorced his wife and tried to marry another. Pope Innocent III placed France under papal interdict, which said that no sacraments were permitted until Philip returned to his wife. Needless to say, Philip did. Witness King John of England. King John refused to accept Stephen Langton as the Archbishop of Canterbury. John was immediately excommunicated. England was placed under interdict, and then Philip II was ordered to invade England and make them comply. Well, King John eventually was required to become a vassal of Innocent III. And finally, John was eventually forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. And so Innocent III was quite a firm-handed pope. Let's look for a moment at Frederick II, and we'll see that link. Frederick II lived 1194 to 1250, and he reigned from 1220 to 1250. Innocent III was made the guardian of Frederick II, who was 3 when his father died. And in those early 14 years prior to Frederick II ascending the throne, there was a great deal of turmoil to get him to the point of ascending the throne, and it was Innocent II that guided Frederick II through that process. And so when Frederick II ascended the throne at 17, he was crowned but required to guarantee that he would not try to unify Germany and Italy, and that he would lead a crusade. Well, Frederick II was going to prove to be a real problem. He reneged on both promises. In fact, upon the death of Innocent III, he sought to annex even the Papal States, let alone that of Italy. Frederick II was viewed as the Antichrist because of his evil ways. He became friendly with Muslims. He maintained the harem. He drove Pope Gregory IX from Rome, was eventually excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX, and Pope Gregory ruled from 1227 to 1241, and so you can see the time frame in which Frederick II was excommunicated. Frederick II executed clergy, desecrated churches, until finally Pope Innocent IV deposed him, imposed excommunication on anyone who recognized him, and anathemized his entire family, the Hohenstaufen family from Germany. Finally, after these measures, he capitulates, and Frederick II dies as a Cistercian monk. So the roles of the popes up through into the 13th century saw themselves as guardians of Christendom. But as one might imagine, it certainly continued the lay investiture issues and increased the tension between the church and the secular realm. And so it isn't quite over, but there are processes in place. Let's look then at the next wave of monastic reform. we want to look at the Cistercians and the Carthusians and the formation of these monastic disciplines. So along with Cluny, in the later 11th century now, the Cistercians are being founded. And we'll first look at the Cistercians. St. Robert of Molesme, a Cluniac monk, in 1098 founds the first Cistercian monastery, and it follows the Benedictine rule, but the Cistercians go to even greater austerities. They're much less, more ascetic, fewer comforts. They worked simply farming the land, mostly subsistence farming, and they lived a very, very simple life, the four tenets of Benedictine spirituality. They wore white habits in lieu of the white habits common at the time to indicate, number one, their poverty, and number two, their simplicity of life. They were very influential in the conversion of the Slavic tribes in Poland, Bohemia, and Eastern Germany. And their order grew upon the efforts of who is known their second founder, St. Bernard of Fontaine, who we know as St. Bernard of Clairvaux. St. Bernard lived 1090 to 1153 and was a Cistercian from 1113 to 1153. And St. Bernard, when he chose to enter the monastery, brought along 30 friends, including 4 of his own brothers. He was the abbot of the new monastery at Clairvaux, where austerity reached a height. There were barren walls, small windows, and meals consisted of bread, boiled leaves and roots with some salt and oil. Bernard came from a noble background and was a model student. He focused his studies on the scriptures and the fathers of the church. He refused promotion to the episcopacy. He didn't want the burden that included the temporal rule aspect of that ecclesial role. He refused election to the papacy. He was very important in resolving some papal disputes. He arbitrated, actually, the schism between Pope Innocent II and Anacletus II. At Étampes, in France, St. Bernard discerned that Innocent II was the genuine pope, and the entire church bowed to that discernment, and so Innocent II was discerned as the true pope. He arbitrated the schism of William, the Duke of Aquitaine, who was persecuting the supporters of Innocent II. William was brought to repentance by St. Bernard's prayer, and in fact was so moved by St. Bernard's prayers for him that he undertook the pilgrimage of St. James to Compostela, Spain, where William died en route. St. Bernard wrote great works of solace to the Christian faithful. He wrote deep works of understanding of the faith in meditating on the words of Christ. He was the counselor to rulers and bishops and popes, including the first Cistercian pope, Blessed Eugene III. He debated Peter Abelard, and the story is that St. Bernard's wisdom and answers left Peter, who was the most renowned thinker of his time, speechless. The final point on St. Bernard of Clairvaux is he was appointed a doctor of the church in 1830 by Pope Pius VIII. Let's look at the foundation of the Carthusian order. It was founded by St. Bruno at Chartreuse near Grenoble. St. Bruno lived 1030 to 1101 and was a monk from 1080 to 1101. In 1075, he was the chancellor of the Diocese of Reims. In 1077, was embroiled in a very hostile takeover of the episcopacy in Reims, and which by 1080 resolved itself to the point that St. Bruno was about to be appointed the bishop there. He didn't want that, and so seeking a life more focused on prayer, he settled in Chartreuse under the guidance of St. Hugh and founded a monastery that was modeled after the Eastern Desert Fathers. And in their spirituality, the monks lived in the same monastery but in individual cells as virtual hermits. In 1088, one of St. Bruno's most accomplished students became Blessed Pope Urban II. St. Bruno, in a most obscure way, is reputed to have played an advisory role in the reign of Blessed Urban II. It is said that he was indeed in Rome, but unknown to most anyone, and he intentionally kept himself out of the limelight so that he could be a private advisor to Blessed Urban II. The Carthusian order did not become as numerous as other monastic orders, in large measure because of the asceticism ascribed to their particular lifestyle. But their simple lifestyles led to a revival of simple prayer and devotion to the practices of Mother Church. And so, how do we wrap this up? From Charlemagne's death in the early 9th century to the Concordat of Worms, it was arguably an unstable time in the history of the Church and of Europe. There was a splintering political order, there were external threats of invasion, there was incredible conflicts between the spiritual and the civil authorities, and the Church then was challenged to maintain spiritual stability and its identity as a temporal institution, for it does exist in the world. Because the Church had great landownings and had great political influence, monasteries and dioceses were indeed plagued with simony and nepotism and weakening fidelity to the teachings of the Church, failed celibacy, loss of piety among the clergy. And these things, certainly in retrospect, are quite predictable. And they wrought the hand for yet again the decided hand of God, the guidance of God, the movement of God. And so consistent with the promise that the gates of hell shall not prevail against her, God in his sovereign majesty appointed great leaders, such as Pope St. Gregory III, Innocent III, St. Bruno, the founder of Cluny, the Irish monastic tradition, St. Bruno, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, to faithfully guide his church through the tempest and to prepare the church for her resurgence in the Middle Ages. So then, for such a time as this, you and I are called. The discussion this morning is the times seem dire. It's not a good time, it seems, in our history. The battles against the church, against honor, against integrity, against that which we hold dear, they're increasing in integrity. And the battlefront is expanding. The faith seems harder to hang on to. But as in times past, so it is today. God's plan is perfect. And submitting our will to his permits us to persevere. And so what do? We need to study. We need to know what it is we believe so that we can transmit it. We need to pray. We need to believe that God knows our needs. We need to make them known to him, believe that he knows our needs and is meeting them. And we need to participate in the life of the church. For the life of the church brings to us the solid understanding, values, graces, mercies of God poured out throughout all of history, and through all of history have survived, that they're available to us. God knows what he's about. This is not the first time we've been in trouble as we are. Pray God it won't be the last. Pray God we survive. Pray God we bring our children and grandchildren to a rich and great knowledge of God who saves the church at each and every moment. Thank you.
Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis.